Everybody. I'm Laurie Brinklow. I'm the interim coordinator of the Master of Arts in Island Studies program at the University of Prince Edward Island, which is a lovely little island off of Canada's east coast. I'm also chair of the Institute of Island Studies at UPEI, which is a research, education, and public policy institute here. So wonderful to see so many familiar faces, or not, I'm not seeing your face, I'm seeing your names in the chat. And I'm really happy to be here this evening doing this, because here in Prince Edward Island, it is evening, it's supper time. So welcome to this session, which is a report on a research project undertaken by the UNESCO Chair in Island Studies and Sustainability here at UPEI. It's called Towards Sustainable Island Futures, Comparing Small Island States and Subnational Island Jurisdictions. The idea is to compare experiences between 6 pairs of islands from around the world to see whether statehood is a boon or a hindrance when implementing sustainable practices in social, political, cultural, artistic, economic, and environmental areas. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relations between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. University of Prince Edward Island, Canada, where I'm coming to you today, is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Abegweit Mi'kmaq First Nation. From coast to coast to coast here in Canada, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people who call this land home, and take this moment to reflect and acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and to consider how we are and can each, in our own way, actively move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So today, when I said familiar faces, these are the people that you're going to see. I know them all. I've known them, some of them for years and years, and it's just wonderful to have put together a team to bring to you today. I'm joined by 5 members of our research team. The first will be Dr. Jim Randall, who is our project's principal investigator, and he's joining us from the North Shore of Prince Edward Island, Canada. Beautiful day again. I'm just going to say, put it out there again. Dr. John Telesford, he's the lead researcher from Grenada. Dr. Preeya Mohan, who is the lead researcher from Trinidad and Tobago. And Dr. Mark Stoddart, our lead researcher from Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. And then last but not least, we'll hear from Dr. Gerard Princeton, our research methodology lead from New Zealand. I'll get them to introduce themselves more fulsomely when they speak, and we'll have about 50 minutes of, that's 50 minutes of presentations. Everybody has a small PowerPoint presentation to show their work. And then we'll have a Q&A or discussion session for about 25 minutes at the end, and we'll wrap things up in 90 minutes. Regarding questions, if you'd like to ask a question for the Q&A discussion, please send it in the chat. We're monitoring it closely, and we will be gathering all the questions for the end. And if you want to address it to one particular person, please say, that's great. And please tell us where you're from too, so that when we get the questions, we can say, hey, there's Catherine Gallant calling in from Ontario, and she has a question for Gerard about, haha, Catherine, no pressure. Anyway, I would, thank you again for joining us tonight and or this morning or tomorrow, wherever you happen to be joining us from. And it's just such a pleasure to be part of the Virtual Island Summit organized by James Ellsmore and his team at Island Innovation. So kicking off, I'm right on time. We have Dr. Jim Randall, who is our UNESCO Chair in Island Studies and Sustainability here in Prince Edward Island. Take it away, Jim.
Thanks, Laurie, and thanks for that introduction. And it's good to see everybody, at least virtually out there. As Laurie sort of alluded to, I've worn a number of hats over the years, but including being in Laurie's position as the coordinator of the master's program at UPI and affiliated with the Institute of Island Studies. At the moment, I'm on sabbatical, which is a wonderful benefit for academic faculty members. But I'm still holding the position of UNESCO Chair in Island Studies and Sustainability. And so I come to you with that position. And that chair is an international chair. It's the purpose of the chair is to facilitate networks of people that are interested in islands and issues related to sustainability. So one of the projects that we had, one of many projects that UNESCO chair had, is a project that I'm just going to bring up a set of slides here. And I'm glad that Laurie sort of organized this session. I don't see the slides here. Just hold on a second. I'm going to put it up here again. Oh, it's at the end of the slides. There it is. That's why you don't see it. So, so this is project. I'll tell you a little bit about this project. Yeah, it's a 3-year project funded by the Canadian Social Science and Humanities Research Council, one of the 3 main research councils, academic research councils in Canada. And it takes as its premise, as Laurie suggested, the fact that islands, as we all know, are not the same. But they're also not unique. They have some things in common. A lot of attention has been paid to small island states or small island developing states. In other words, the politically independent states. Over the years, up until recently, there's been less attention that's been paid to what has been referred to by my colleague and friend, Godfrey Baldacchino, as subnational island jurisdictions, or SNIJs. And this is a little bit surprising. It's maybe that they're less transparent because they're part of a larger nation state. But when you think of the hundreds, if not thousands, of these subnational island jurisdictions, they can be very significant on a global level in a variety of different ways. So for example, some of them are quite large in terms of population. So think of Hainan, the province of Hainan, China, that has over 9 million people in it. Think of some of the offshore financial centers like the British Virgin Islands and the Cayman Islands, and even some of the Channel Islands off of Great Britain. And they can be quite important economically for the global financial system. Ecologically, I think we're all aware of the high level of biodiversity and the biodiversity hotspots on islands, but think of the Galapagos as a subnational island jurisdiction as part of Ecuador. Strategically, I think we're all realize now, if you look at the South China Sea and East China Sea, and places like the Chagos Archipelago and Diego Garcia, how important some of these sort of semi-autonomous kinds of islands can be. And when you start looking at some of these quasi-independent or semi-autonomous islands, you realize that they're not all the same. And it's tempting sometimes to think of them as only 2 groups. And in fact, the project implies that there are 2 groups. But there's an array of differences across these different groups. Some of them are former colonies. So Martinique as a French colony, or the Azores as a Portuguese former colony. Some of them are part of federated states. So my own island right now, Prince Edward Island, as a province of Canada, or Hawaii as a province of, as a state of the United States. The relations that they have sometimes are quite unique. So it's very difficult sometimes to pin down what the relationship is with a larger state or metropole. So there's differences of understanding between, for example, the relationship between Taiwan or Hong Kong, or even the Faroe Islands themselves. Some of them have very unusual sounding relationships. So think of the Cook Islands and its free association with New Zealand. Over the years, one of the features we've seen of these subnational island jurisdictions is that many of them have resisted the lure of independence. Formal independence. And they've done that even though they have repeatedly had referenda that have allowed them the opportunity to become independent. And there's often a tension that exists, not always, but a tension that exists between cultural nationalism, or an attempt to try to define themselves as a people on an island, and potentially in economic and trade advantages of maintaining a semi-autonomous status. So that's sort of an outset, a little bit of a context, but let's look at the purpose of this project. And you see in italics at the top of this slide, the overall purpose is to better understand sustainable development practices and potential of small islands in all forms, but especially the role that sovereignty, and I could even expand that to say forms of governance and international relationships play in achieving a more sustainable future. And then there are three different sort of objectives beyond this purpose. One is to examine the similarities and differences between these two groups, and then to compare the relationships that these islands have with that larger, either the larger metropole in the case of subnational island jurisdictions, or the larger world, the world of islands as well. And finally, does the political status, the governance relationships on these islands, the small island state versus a SNIJ, do they influence the daily lives of islanders? So as I mentioned at the beginning of this, we're midway through a 3-year project here, and funding is from one of the Canadian governments. I'll say right at the outset here that this is a partnership development grant. So although it is a research grant, the explicit purpose of this is to build partnerships, to develop, to facilitate networks. And so if we can develop more networks with some people out there on this call, please contact myself and Laurie and we will build you into this partnership. On this project, we have partners from 6 pairs of islands, and you can see on this slide down here, the 6 pairs of islands. And these pairs were selected partly because of population, the economy, a shared perhaps political history or colonial history. And so these are the 6 pairs of islands. And we're doing 2 stages of the research. The first was an online survey of island stakeholders. And the second would be a focus group of a subgroup of those stakeholders. So stage 1, and stage 1, as I'll show in a slide in just a moment, has almost been completed for all 12 of these islands. And it consisted of a structured survey, mostly closed-ended questions, and a stratified sample of participants was taken from 6 different groups of people. The first group would be from civil society, reps from NGOs, academics, or youth and students. And the second group are people from government representatives, business or entrepreneurs, or people from workers or trade unions. And you'll see down here 3 sort of categories of questions. We had a bunch of questions, but I've just given you the category. So the one set of questions related to the attitudes or the perceptions of the participants regarding the performance of the number of institutions of governance in those places. So for example, we might have questions on asking people to rate the performance as well as the degree of satisfaction with the institutions of governance like the police, the judiciary, the national, regional, or municipal governments if they happen to have them. A second set of questions asked people to rate the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals and what they believe are the success of their own governments in achieving the SDGs on their islands. But here we also asked people whether they'd incorporated the SDGs into their own lives. And we'd use surrogate indicators of SDGs to try to personalize it based upon the literature itself. And finally, we gave each pair of islands an opportunity to look at an issue that was specific to that pair of islands. So many of the islands have chosen sustainable tourism management. Some, as you'll hear from some of the speakers, looked at responses to financial crises. Stage 2, and only 2 islands have gone through the stage 2 because of the pandemic. And I'm getting my cue that I'm almost at the end here, so I'm gonna wrap up here. So you can see on the right-hand side, some of the questions that we were asking in the focus groups. You can see the state of the survey completion. Most of those islands have already, and those are the numbers of people that have completed the surveys. Some of them are still open and a couple are still just about to start. So where do we go from here? You'll hear in just a moment from some of the others. What's the relevance of this? One, as I said, is this is a partnership development grant. So this is a way of developing stronger relationships between the groups of people, the co-investigators, and their own teams of researchers. And we've already seen this happen, and I hope that this summit will actually increase that number of people. The other one, as you'll hear from one of our speakers today, is to look at methods and comparative relevance, to see how people in different cultures actually perceive the research. There are policy outcomes, and how does sustainability really manifest itself in the everyday lives of people? And I'll end right there. Thank you, Laurie.
Great, thanks, Jim.
Stop share here.
Yeah, that's great, wonderful. Good overview. You can see the scope of work that we've undertaken, and it's going really, really well, despite COVID-19. Next up, we have Dr. John Telesford, who is the lead researcher for Grenada. He is from the TEA Marryshow Community College in Grenada. So John, do you want to join us, please?
Yes, here I am. Good. Thanks, Laurie. And good afternoon, good morning, good day to all attendees. And let me just share my screen very quickly. So my name is John Telesford, as Laurie alluded to, and I am a full-time employee at the TA Marryshow Community College here in Grenada as Associate Dean within the School of Continuing Education. And I also hold an honorific position with the Institute of Island Studies as a research associate. And it has really been a pleasure. It is a pleasure to be a part of this partnership grant, which allowed me and Grenada to get some insight on what is happening on the ground with people's perception towards what Jim has indicated the research is intending to do. So I'll just run you through very quickly on a snippet or a snapshot of some of the information or the data that we've gathered so far in Grenada. And my colleague, partner island Tobago, will present a sort of a mirror of what happened in Tobago. And Tobago would also give a sort of a summary, a sort of a comparative summary of our preliminary findings thus far. So Grenada, we're here in the Eastern Caribbean, very small island, 344 kilometers square, just about maybe 113,000 people. We were independent on the 7th of February, 1974. We have a bicameral parliamentary system with two houses, the lower house with 15 elected members. Our constituencies, including the islands of Carriacou and Petite Martinique to the north, as you would see on the little map there to your right. And the upper house, or the Senate, which consists of selected members, 7 selected by the government, the opposition selects 3, and there are 3 interest groups, including the private sector and the farming industry, represented in the Senate. The administrative arm of governance or government consists of the Cabinet of Ministers. We have the legal and judiciary arm. And our main economic sectors are tourism, agriculture, and construction. So as Jim indicated, we paired with Tobago, and as I mentioned earlier, Jim also went through the approach. We used a stratified sample of individuals from 2 groups of people, civil society and the social partners. For Grenada, we selected 137 persons were sent the survey, and we received 56 responses. So thus far, we've done 2 of the focus groups. We haven't gotten to our household focus group. We had some challenges going into the end of last year. And with the advent of COVID, we still have not gotten to the point of completing that. But I'm going to just indicate a report on 4 questions from the groups of questions that were in the survey, as was alluded to. The perceptions of the performance of institutions in Grenada as the perspective from the participants. We speak just to the Sustainable Development Goals, as the Sustainable Development Goals is now the driver of global sustainable development, and here too, and I think in all islands globally. And all islands focus on sustainable tourism, and we'll give a bit of insight into the preliminary results on one or two questions in that category. So who responded? The majority of persons who responded came from NGOs and followed by government employees. If you look to the top left of the first table there, you will see the demographics there. The age of the respondents were over 40 majority, with 54 years and above. The majority of people indicated that they were just above that age. We had maybe an equal mix of male-female respondents with a slightly higher response from the males. Employment on the second table, most of the persons were indicated that they were full-time employees, and the majority of persons came from, indicated that they belong to 2 adult households with children. So question on the first section of the questions on the perception of the participants. On these issues here: the economy, public service, relations with various stakeholders, safety and security, public information and assistance programs, education and healthcare. And the direct question was, how satisfied are you currently with your island government's performance on these areas? And we see that the green bars were very low, ranging below 10% of the respondents indicated that they were extremely satisfied, with the performance of these institutions and sectors. And the towering yellow bars indicate that most of the people were somewhat satisfied. If we look at the healthcare, which is to the extreme right of the chart, we note that many people, just about 35%, indicated that they were extremely dissatisfied with the healthcare system. Another question on that section asks to indicate how much you agree or disagree with the following statements. And the statement 1 to the left: the relationship our island has forged internationally, have had positive impacts on my well-being. And we see again that most of the respondents indicated that they were somewhat satisfied, with just about 10% saying that they were strongly agree that the relationships that the government has formed is really impacting positively on their well-being. Similarly, on the island's economy, we see again that the most respondents indicated that they were somewhat satisfied with the yellow bars. We had a little higher strongly agreement with the green bars, indicating that they strongly agreed that the international relationships have positively impacted on the island's economy. On the second set of questions, which targeted sustainable development in general and the SDGs, we only reported on one question, and that's in the interest of time. There were actually 5 or 6 questions in that section, but as I said, as the SDGs would be the global drivers, we only reported on that question. And if we look to what we did here was just rank the strongly importance, the persons who felt strongly that a particular SDG was important. And if we look over to the left of the bar charts, we see that SDG 3, which speaks to ensuring healthy lifestyles, ranked number 1, followed by SDG 1 ending poverty, and SDG 4 on ensuring equitable education, were ranked as the top 3. And these SDGs I refer to as focus on socio-economic issues and drivers, and contrast that to what is happening with how people felt the importance of what I call the environment focused SDGs, which are somewhere in the middle there, SDG 15, SDG 13, and SDG 14. 15 speaking to life above land, on land, 13 speaking to climate change, and 14 they're speaking to life below water. We look down to the end where with the SDGs that they felt were least important, SDG 11, which spoke to human settlements, and SDG 5, interestingly, on gender equality, ranking not so high compared to the others up there. Two other quick questions. Please rate your level of agreement with each of the following statements regarding sustainable tourism. And each statement there, we see that persons strongly agree with each of these statements, which gives an indication that the persons who responded maybe have a good understanding of what this whole issue of sustainable tourism is all about. So for example, if we look at the second from the left, climate change has an important implication for sustainable tourism. About 80% of the respondents strongly agreed that that is so. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. That was great. Now I'm really looking forward to hearing Preeya, Dr. Preeya Mohan, who is joining us from Trinidad. And Preeya is with the University of the West Indies, the St. Augustine campus. And so she looked at Tobago, which is the island, the subnational island jurisdiction of Trinidad, and will, as John said, present a kind of mirror presentation based on their research already. Take it away, Preeya.
Thank you, Laurie. I guess everyone can see my screen. Thank you, Laurie, for the introduction. Thanks, John, for setting the stage. As John would have said, Tobago is the island pair for Grenada. So good afternoon or good morning to everyone. I would like to begin by thanking the University of Prince Edward Island for the opportunity to be part of this exciting research project. I would also like to thank the Virtual Island Summit organizers for the opportunity to present. So let's get into it. Why study Tobago? Tobago can be described as a subnational island jurisdiction. It has been a ward of Trinidad since 1899. It is located southernly in the Caribbean Sea. It has a population of 80,874 persons, or just 4.6% of the total population. Its land size is 300 square kilometers, which is 1.2% of the total land size. The local governing body is the Tobago House of Assembly. Tobago also has 2 parliamentary seats out of a total of 41 for Trinidad and Tobago, Tobago East and Tobago West. Tobago's economy is heavily dependent on what occurs in the tourism sector. Tourism is a major contributor to GDP and employment and accounts for almost all of the island's exports and foreign exchange earnings. Government spending is also a significant contributor to the economy. This money comes from the national budget of Trinidad and Tobago to the Tobago House of Assembly. From this budget, the Tobago House of Assembly employs around 62% of the total labor force in Tobago. The Tobago economy is therefore tightly linked with the Trinidad economy for its annual budgetary contribution and employment. The Trinidad economy, in turn, is based on the oil and gas sector.
Preeya, can I just interrupt for a sec? Would you be able to actually put your screen so that the slideshow is going? It will blow up, it'll go large then so people can read the print? Should be from, just if you do from current.
Is that better? Yes?
Preeya, if you click where it says from current slide, the play button just to the left of where your cursor is now. There you go, thank you.
Thank you. So in terms of the data and methodology, Tobago and Grenada served as the pilot for the wider study. As was said earlier, a stratified sample of individuals from civil society, government and business would have been looked at. We had an online survey using SurveyMonkey, and 51 persons responded for Tobago. We also had 3 focus groups for civil society, social partners, and households. And all 3 focus groups were completed and transcribed. So who participated in this study from Tobago? We had a mix of government, private sector, NGOs, and academics. Persons were generally over the age of 25. More females, slightly more females than males participated. Individuals who participated generally had a high level of education and were employed, whether part-time or full-time. Also, most persons lived in a 2-adult household with children with income about the same or greater than others in their community. Going into the results, recall that the aim of the study is to develop a better understanding of the relationship between governance and islanders' perceptions of sustainability, sustainable development, and the SDGs. Looking at the preliminary results, respondents were asked how satisfied they are with their government's performance. And the graphs in my presentation will show the questionnaire results for Tobago, and they correspond with the graphs showed earlier by John for Grenada. And here we see that persons in Tobago are generally dissatisfied with the management of relations with Trinidad. Also, less respondents in Tobago, in our case, the subnational island jurisdiction, were satisfied with the management of relations with other international governments versus Grenada. Also across the other dimensions, including the economy, public services, relations with stakeholders, safety and security, public information and assistance programs, education and healthcare, persons in Tobago were generally less satisfied with their government's performance as opposed to persons in Grenada. Next, looking at the relationships forged internationally, we see that in Tobago, compared to Grenada, less persons agreed that these brought about positive impacts on their well-being and the economy. A large portion of respondents also did not know or had no opinion on whether these relationships were important, while this was not the case for Grenada. Of note, however, persons in Tobago felt that the relationship forged with Trinidad positively affected their well-being and the economy more so than international relationships. Shifting our attention to the Sustainable Development Goals. In Tobago, among the goals ranked as most important were focused on the environment, including Goal 14, Life Below Water, Goal 15, Life on Land, and Goal 13, Climate Action. On the other hand, when John presented, we saw that the goals ranked among the most important in Grenada were socioeconomic in nature, including Goal 3, Good Health and Well-being, Goal 1, No Poverty, and Goal 4, Quality Education. Now, as Jim would have said in the beginning, country pairs in the wider study would examine site-specific issues, and in the case of Grenada and Tobago, the issue is sustainable tourism. Why sustainable tourism? Tourism plays an important role in island communities. Islands are among the most tourism-penetrated destinations in the world. Tourism is also often the only type of economic activity small islands can offer. Further, sustainable tourism is often a far bigger challenge in islands where the capacity to implement sustainable tourism practices is often limited, with huge negative environmental and social consequences. So looking at sustainable tourism perceptions, respondents in Tobago strongly agreed that they understand the concept of sustainable tourism, believe that climate change has important implications for tourism, believe that natural resource protection and tourism can be compatible, believe that protection of local heritage and culture and tourism can be compatible, believe that well-managed tourist attractions maintained in their natural state are important for attracting tourists, and most importantly, these islanders felt that tourism demand, there is certainly demand for sustainable tourism on their island. The difference in this question and my counterpart in Grenada, there was a high level of agreement across both islands. However, we saw that the level of agreement in Tobago was much higher. So in closing, I would now like to speak about our way forward for the island pair, Grenada and Tobago. Going forward, we intend to develop the comparisons between Grenada, a small island developing state, and Tobago, a subnational island jurisdiction, by analyzing in depth both the questionnaire and focus group data. Specifically, we intend to look at the relationship between governance and islanders' perceptions of sustainability, sustainable development, and the sustainable development goals. We would also investigate the importance of these issues to islanders and their rating of their government's performance. Also, the issue of sovereignty, international relationships, and the mainland to metropole relationship and sustainable development would be examined. Lastly, sustainable tourism, perceptions, support, and practices would also be studied. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Preeya. It's great to see these two comparisons back to back like this, because we've only seen the data is not compared yet. It's just individual islands so far. I'm the lead researcher for Prince Edward Island, along with Susanna Russell from St. Lucia. And we've looked at the data, but we haven't actually done these comparisons. And it's so fantastic to see what you two have done in making these comparisons. I know we have lots more to do, and that's going to be the joy and the fun of this project. Next up, we have Dr. Mark Stoddart. He is the lead researcher from Memorial University in Newfoundland and Labrador, which is one of those islands a little bit east of Prince Edward Island, northeast. So Mark, would you please like to come on screen?
Yes, I should be there now, I think, Laurie, with the presentation. There we go. All right, is that showing now, Laurie?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining from time zones scattered near and far. It's about dinner time here, as well as Laurie mentioned in the PI. I'm going to present something quite a bit different than the last two. As part of the Newfoundland and Labrador and Iceland comparisons, we've looked in a bit more qualitative manner at kind of case studies of financial crisis, in addition to also doing the surveys that Jim spoke of. Before I get into it, though, I'll quickly acknowledge my collaborators who helped me prep this presentation, Cole Latlin and Stoddart daughter at Memorial University and University of Iceland. The two of them drove a lot of the actual case study analysis that I'll be synthesizing here at a pretty high level. I'm kind of focusing mostly on 4 lessons that can be learned from comparing points of financial crisis in
Mark,
Iceland.
sorry to interrupt you. It's quite difficult to hear you. There's a interruption on your audio. I'm not sure if you're able to readjust your microphone or put in headphones potentially.
I can try. The headphones I have haven't been working well with Zoom lately, though. So
Okay, this is also not working well, unfortunately. It's a bit robotic to hear you. Sorry to
let me
interrupt your presentation.
get the audio settings for Zoom up. So the mic is showing that it's at as high as it will go.
It's not.
Unfortunately,
It's completely distorted. I'm not sure if there's a way we can get around that or switch the presentation.
Sorry, what's that?
I'm not sure if there's a way to get around that. If we can have someone, perhaps, would it make sense to switch the presentations and let you do it? If not, we'll just go ahead. It's just quite difficult to hear you.
James, I can hear it. It's a little distorted, but I can hear it.
Okay, we'll go ahead.
Okay, I'll try to speak louder and closer to the mic, perhaps. Yeah, because I don't have a mic that works very well right at the moment. It's due for replacement, unfortunately. All right. So to pick up there, what we're looking at in terms of the comparative case studies for these two cases is essentially the financial crisis in 2008 in Iceland, and linking that with the Muskrat Falls kind of moment crisis that's still ongoing in Newfoundland and Labrador. And what you'll see here is, unlike the other pairs, Newfoundland's a bit unique in that it's an island, but Labrador is the mainland part of the province where the actual mega hydro project we're talking about is actually set, right? So here we're looking for what we can learn at a higher level by comparing these two kind of periods of financial crisis. All right, so the key takeaways, I think, just to start really up front, are that there are really similar lessons that we can draw from both cases about failures of communication, transparency, and accountability that can be used to help prevent similar crises and ultimately contribute to more sustainable island futures. And these are basically the four things we draw that we see kind of similar across the two cases. That there was a politics of anti-reflexivity that led to high-risk decision-making, that there were issues of communication flows and transparency, that there were public protests that translated the financial crisis into a crisis of political legitimacy, more so in Iceland than in Newfoundland, Labrador, which I'll speak to in a minute. And finally, a lack of media scrutiny of decision-making and decision makers, all of which fed into these two crises of economic sustainability. So both of these crises looked like they were sudden, but of course context matters, and both had deeper roots. On one hand, Iceland had for several years seen a growing neoliberal influence in its financial sector, its political sphere, a kind of a privatization of the banks, and a growing boom mentality kind of leading up to the 2008 crisis. They kind of fed a culture of high-risk behavior in the financial sector. So in the years leading up to the crisis, there was a kind of a deeper history of good governance not keeping pace with privatization. By contrast, Newfoundland has kind of what Arlie Hochschild talks about as like a deep story of being cheated on previous hydro development on the upper Churchill River in Labrador by the government of Quebec and by the federal government in the 1960s and 1970s. This idea that there was the province didn't get its fair share of earlier hydro development in Labrador. At the same time, in the years leading up to the Muskrat Falls crisis, there was the optimism of the oil boom starting from the early 2000s until the oil price decline of a few years ago. And also really important to this case are Newfoundland-Labrador dynamics between the island and Labrador, which is kind of an interesting inversion. Often subnational island jurisdictions are kind of resource hinterlands or peripheries of mainland political centers. That is true here in Newfoundland, but to a large degree, but also the Labrador part of the province is in its own turn a bit of a hinterland region traditionally, a kind of resource pool for the island and its political center. So that's a really important part of that story as well, and particularly that Labrador is where most of the province's Indigenous population, large part of it is Innu Nation, Nunatsiavut, Nunatuavut, etc. So there's also Indigenous settler colonial issues that come up in that context as well. So looking a little more closely at the four lessons we draw, again, at a very high level from comparing these cases, what we mostly see is that first and foremost, a politics of anti-reflexivity ended up reinforcing high-risk decision-making in the few years leading up to the crisis. So we saw that there was very overly optimistic orientations by governments, as well as by key agencies that were responsible for monitoring the financial sector, so the Central Bank of Iceland and the Financial Supervisory Authority in the Icelandic case, or that were responsible for the hydroelectric development, as in the case of Nellacor in Newfoundland and Labrador. We saw that critical voices were largely marginalized in the political and public sphere, that there was a lot of failures of these key agencies to implement the oversight and accountability that they were supposed to be responsible for, and that there was really an ignoring of the early warning signs that came from independent experts or from independent reviews, such as the International Monetary Fund for Iceland, or from environmental impact assessments, or the Public Utilities Board assessment in Newfoundland and Labrador. So the second lesson we can maybe draw then as well is about transparency and communication, which were largely failures of which helped deepen the crisis once it started setting in. So once the crisis was acknowledged in both cases, there were definite issues of transparency, problems with information flow, etc., that arguably we think made these crises worse. So there were government communication gaps within government, amongst decision makers and between various key agencies on one hand, but on the other hand, there was also transparency issues between government and decision makers and the general public. So there was kind of internal within government communication gaps, or between government and key agencies, but also those external communication gaps that helped kind of worsen these crises. Third, where we did see sort of political reflexivity kind of erupt or become provoked, tended to be through public protest and public opposition once the crisis was apparent. And so public anger kind of amplified these crises and turned them from simply financial crises into crises of political legitimacy to varying degrees. And this is one of the key differences between Iceland and Newfoundland and Labrador, where we don't necessarily see the same thing playing out. But in both cases, we do see that kind of protest does emerge that pushes back against these dominant government narratives. So in the Icelandic case, the idea that the banks were too big to fail, that really legitimized a lot of the government response to the crisis. Or in Newfoundland and Labrador, the narrative that the mega hydro project of Muskrat Falls was just too far along to turn back, right? So public discourse kind of was a bit of a check on that, or a counter discourse. Yeah. And so what we saw was a public discourse in Iceland about elitist behavior and corruption in the political system, and in Newfoundland and Labrador, more of a focus on environmental risks and environmental health impacts for downstream, predominantly indigenous communities in Labrador. So the big difference, as I alluded to, is that the Icelandic protests had much more scale and political efficacy, and were much more effective, we see, at provoking social learning, provoking political reform, and so on and so forth. Finally, media scrutiny was generally lacking until after the crisis was apparent. So media narratives tended to reinforce the optimism of government and decision makers. We saw less space for critical voices, and that in Iceland in particular led to a loss of media credibility. So we argue that there needs to be a stronger range of media scrutiny of those decision makers, and it shouldn't really be left only to public protest to serve as the main force of government accountability for these financial crises. So to conclude, because I see Laurie in the corner of my screen, one thing we would say from comparing these two cases is that Iceland, I think, has managed the crisis better. Once it was acknowledged, intervention was relatively quick. Things that probably facilitated that was the consensus-oriented political structure of Icelandic political culture, probably also provoked by the strength of the protest movement that was very successful, and also helped by some external factors like the tourism boom and so on and so forth, and kind of the general recovery from the 2008 financial crisis. By contrast, Muskrat Falls is part of a still deepening financial crisis in Newfoundland and Labrador that's been magnified by the oil price declines of the last few years. And by contrast with Iceland, the largely indigenous-led land protectors that mobilized against the project seem to have much less political efficacy, which leads us to suggest that principles of respect for UNDRIP and free and prior informed consent need to be strengthened significantly in the political sphere here in Newfoundland and Labrador. So I'll skip the going forward because basically just to say that we're doing the survey as well. Essentially all that was going to say. And close by saying that we believe by learning these lessons about anti-reflexivity, communication and transparency, public anger, and political legitimacy and media scrutiny, that we can draw some really important lessons about moving towards more sustainable island futures. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will turn that over. Thanks.
Fantastic, Mark. Thank you. Thanks for bringing us perspective from those two great islands in the North Atlantic and a whole other look at not just sustainable tourism, but also financial crises, which is terrific. Last but not least, we have Dr. Gerard Princeton, who is joining us from Massey University in New Zealand. And we brought Gerard on board because he is a fantastic fellow and we adore him, but also because he's such a good head when it comes to thinking about research methodology. And so that's his big contribution to this project. And so I will ask Gerard to please join us.
Can you hear me? I can't get my...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Here we are.
I can hear you. There you are.
Yep.
Good. Okay.
Okay. Good day to everyone. Kia ora. I have an interesting task to kind of comment on the work of my colleagues. This has been, as James has said, a research in comparing small island states and comparing then the sovereign states and the subnational island jurisdictions. The question that Jim put out in front is, what's the purpose of this project? Is to contribute to a better understanding of sustainable development in sustainable islands and the role that sovereignty plays in that. And I think this brings us to, and this is the only slide I have, so don't worry. This brings us to the question of why do we do this research? And I think as this research team got going, questions arose in the team about who wants to know. We are comparing different sets of islands, but actually what is the interest of our research for the islanders involved? And there's of course been in research teams always the concern about positionality, if you want. And particularly island studies, I think, or islands have been among the most researched objects in social sciences. There's often, however, a sort of, as someone has called it, the gaze from the arriving vessel to the islands. So it's looking at the islands from the outside. And there is much less research looking, let's say, standing on the beach, looking at the sea and looking at the neighbors on the island. And I think that sort of positionality, for who are we doing this research, is a question that needs answering. And especially when we do comparative research, the question is, who wants to know? Who cares? That is one aspect that I think we are trying to address. And one of the things we do is we interview the researchers. So we interviewed Preeya, we interviewed John, and we asked them, who do you think benefits from your research? Now that you have nearly completed it, who benefits and how? And we split that question into two. Who benefits on the island and how do they benefit from this research? And who benefits beyond the island and how would they benefit? As you will have understood, we're halfway the journey and there's not much I could share in terms of findings. But I think it is important to continuously keep in mind this question, who benefits from this research? Why are we doing this? Is it only for the benefit of the researchers or an international community? I heard in the comparisons between Tobago and Grenada, between Iceland and Newfoundland, some people would say, and Mark made that comment as well, Iceland is doing better than Newfoundland in that respect, or the government of Grenada is doing worse as compared to Tobago's authorities in another respect. The question is, does that matter? to the people in the island. This is a cartoon that I would like to share. It's a cartoon on inequality or unfairness in education. Some of you may have seen this cartoon. We see this man, and it's got to be a man, it's always a man, and it's probably a European man, and he sets up this exam. And he tells the monkey, the penguin, the elephant, the goldfish, the seal, and the dog, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. This cartoon has often been used, and some of you, I think, may have seen this as an example to discuss the unfairness of external parties doing a competitive research, whereby we rank countries like the most free in terms of economic undertakings, the most responsive in terms of crises, the most resilient. We rank countries. In essence, the SDGs do exactly the same thing. If you look at the annual reports of the SDGs, we compare a series of countries, and then some come on top and some come at the bottom. And I think most of us would have a fair feeling who of the 193 countries end up on the top and which are the countries that end at the bottom. The question is, does that matter? And who benefits from ranking all these countries? And I think, and this is my closing, I think we can look at this cartoon also in a different fashion. It is not just unfair to ask the goldfish, please climb the mountain. We can also ask the monkey, the penguin, the elephant, and the goldfish, the seal, and the dog, do you actually care whether you can or cannot climb that mountain, whether you're better or worse than the monkey? Why would the goldfish aspire to be able to climb that tree? There's not much for the goldfish up there. Same goes for the seal, for the dog. And I think this is the question about who controls research questions. We want to compare and contrast sovereign and non-sovereign territories. Does that matter for people living on those two islands? And I think that's a question without answers at this point in time. I would like to, in closing, acknowledge my colleagues, because this is not my own work. I'm doing this with Kimberly Chu Foon at University of Prince Edward Island in Canada, Margaret Patterson at the same university, and Sue Ann Waite at the university here in at Massey in New Zealand. I think that is all I have to say, Laurie. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard. And it's certainly food for thought as we head forward into the second half of this research project. Who are we doing it for? And what difference is it going to make? This is the time when we open up the conversation to the audience, and we've had a very active chat line going on, and it's been quite exciting to see some of the comments that people have made and where they're all coming from, and some of the questions, and getting more ideas for more islands. Gerard, do you want to take yours off screen sharing, and then I'll ask everybody to turn on their cameras so you'll be able to see everybody. Excellent. And let me just change mine to gallery view so that I'm seeing everybody as well. Excellent. Okay. So I had Maggie Henry here from the Institute of Island Studies been taking the questions out of the chat and putting them into a file for me so that I can try and group them together maybe, or and figure out who to ask them of. So the first question came from Phyllis Doig from the United States, and it was for Jim because he started off, of course, and she was wondering, prior to the survey, did you perform a baseline comparison of islands in terms of their physical and technological infrastructure, or some other measures that may influence their survey responses? So sure. I remember the conversations that we've had about who do we include and why.
This is Phyllis?
Yes.
Yeah, good question, Phyllis. Interestingly enough, we had a meeting very early in this project, and some of the people involved in the project could come physically to PEI, because the proposal actually was a two-stage proposal methodology. The first was a one that you didn't see mentioned so far, and that was to do sort of a second look at secondary data for all of the islands, as many as we could find, and then try to find some way of sorting those islands into groups based on secondary data. And when we met as a group, the subgroup that met said, listen, this is almost like chasing your tail. We could be going for years trying to find what are the best indicators, and as Gerard said, what would we get at the end of that process? So effectively what we did was we turned the methodology in its head, and we put the more context specific portion of it at the start of it. And that was the surveys and then the focus groups. And at the end of it, once we realized what was going to be important, then we would know what to focus on when we started looking at secondary indicators. So the secondary indicators are still there, but we felt that it was more important to look at the context based upon each of those 12 islands rather than get lost down that rabbit hole of secondary indicators. I hope that answered it.
Thanks, Jim. Did anybody have anything that they'd like to add to that? If you were in on the conversation, I know that John was there and Gerard was there at that first meeting. No worries if you don't, we'll go on to the next question. This one's from Francesco Sindico, who is one of our colleagues at this SCELG at the Strathclyde Centre for Environmental Law and Governance in Glasgow, Scotland. And he's asking the question, anyway, I know it's Scotland, I thought it was in, I'm showing my ignorance here about where SCELG is actually located. Anyway, question for John and Jim. Were you able to ask the extent to which the SDGs are understood and implemented as a whole and not by taking each one separately? John, do you want to go first? Or Jim, doesn't matter.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the exact questions that we had, but I think we looked at the SDGs mostly on a separated approach, asking persons to first of all indicate, as we reported, which ones they think were the most important. And then we pitched it, as Jim indicated in his introduction, within their everyday lives, rewording them in a way that it reflected in their everyday lives. So we did not particularly take a holistic approach, but looked at it more in an individual. I think it is a good idea or a good thought to maybe look at the analysis in maybe an integrated way.
And if I just add to what John said, I think you saw on both Preeya's presentation and John's, they did have a more global question on their understanding of sustainable tourism. We did not ask a separate question on just their overall understanding of the SDGs, but what we're going to do, Francesco, is come up with a composite indicator. When you start looking at how people have personalized the SDGs in their own lives, or their understanding of individual SDGs, you can actually, there are methodologies out there that allow you to come up with a composite measure that combines all of those, the individual understandings of all of those statements.
Laurie, may I add?
Yes, please.
So John and Jim would have spoken specifically about the questionnaire where the issues of the individual SDGs, we would have asked respondents, but in the focus groups, which I have had the opportunity to do for Tobago before COVID-19 actually happened, we did ask about the SDGs as a general broad question. Basically, the question would have been, what is your understanding of the SDGs? It was a broad question and it phrased that way. And just a general overview of what happened in the focus group. To our surprise, we found that NGOs were actually very knowledgeable about the SDGs. However, the other stakeholders involved, in particular households, were not so informed about the SDGs. So NGOs and persons, technocrats in the government would have been informed of the SDGs, while even private sector persons were not that well informed about the SDGs and let's say an ordinary Tobagonian when we did the household group.
Thank you, Preeya. And just in looking at our initial, the initial look at the data that came from St. Lucia and Prince Edward Island, I would say that Prince Edward Islanders had a much less awareness of the SDGs, just at a very high look at the responses to the questions. St. Lucians were much more aware of SDGs than we were here. I have a question for Mark, and this is coming from Eileen Terrer in Fiji, and I'm sorry if I butchered your name, Eileen. She asks, the lack of communication that you mentioned, would that be more from a coordination perspective or just not understanding each other's role or mandate and policies?
I think what we see in both cases that's quite interesting is there was a lot of gaps within government and between government and the key agencies that should have been providing oversight and accountability. So it wasn't even miscommunication as much as a lack of communication or gaps in communication that nobody was, the government wasn't necessarily checking in on NALCOR, say, or the Central Bank of Iceland, or communication just wasn't flowing from one agency to another. And then that was even more amplified by especially early on, a kind of a lack of openness or transparency to the public and the media then as well. So you had both kind of communication gaps that seem to kind of amplify each other and really make these crises worse as they started becoming apparent. So yeah, I'd say it was more a matter of gaps more than not understanding each other. Yeah. And actually, I was going to also see if I could just say a bit about the SDG question previously. I mean, I could have come at this financial crisis a bit from sideways because I'm primarily an environmental sociologist. So I think as we have the survey data, my biggest interest is how people's perceptions of financial sustainability, which are the kind of questions we're asking specifically to Newfoundland and Labrador and Iceland, really how those do fit into a more holistic understandings of the SDGs as well. So I think that's, I think like Jim alluded to, even though they're kind of separate in the survey, I think analytically that's a big part of where I'm also very curious and interested to go as well. So.
Great, thank you. I have another question for you, Mark, here. This one is from Aaron McWilliams in Arizona, asking, how do you feel the disparity in literacy rates between Newfoundland and Iceland influence both reaction to and recovery time from these economic crises? Interesting question.
So that's an interesting, yeah, I mean, partly because Iceland is like, literacy is such a deep part of the culture, of political culture there. So I think that, I don't know if it's about literacy per se. I think it's maybe more the way that's translated into a very deep history of citizen engagement, of civil society kind of activism. So I think there's just a very different, we see a level of engagement in the citizenry of the two jurisdictions. And I think we see that in the sense of how broad and widespread the kind of protest movement was in Iceland, whereas here, it was very vibrant, but very limited to, largely indigenous community leadership and their allies. So it didn't get the same broad base that we saw in Iceland, right? So I would say that, yeah, like literacy is maybe a really interesting background factor, but I think that's probably helped feed a very rich history in Iceland of very deep political engagement that made a big difference, I think, in how these two crises have been handled. Yeah.
No, that would be a study unto itself, wouldn't it? That's terrific. Here's a question from Francesco again, and this one's for Gerard. We got to get you talking here. He says, great presentation. I'm not sure I would say the SDGs rank countries. I do not think countries would have accepted the SDGs in the first place had there been an idea of ranking one country vis-a-vis another. I would say that the SDGs are a process that aims to push countries to move their societies forward. It's not perfect, nothing is, but the goal-setting nature of the SDGs is not aimed, in my opinion, to praise or shame any country. He says, apologies for the long question comment. Would you like to, do you have anything to add to that, Gerard, or respond to? Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
Yep, sure. With all respect, you could argue that the SDGs are a call to action to all nations or to all governments, and that's fair enough. But if you look at the reporting that goes on, it's long pages of ranking nation states against each other on each of the different indicators, and there's 231 of them in the course of a year. The entire reporting system is based on how far has each country got into the achieving the targets. And the problem for me with that sort of approach is that it doesn't really take into account the progress a nation has made vis-a-vis its own position, let's say a year ago. So a country may make, let's say, an improvement of 10%, but if you're at the bottom of the pile, you're unlikely to go up in the ranking as to your neighbors. So you're comparing countries to each other. That generates a competitive environment instead of saying, where have we been in our own past with this indicator? And there's another element that I'd like to add to that, that is the selection of the indicators. Let's say, for example, the silliest one would be the incidence of malaria. Now, obviously, if you live in Sweden, the chances of Sweden scoring low or poorly on the incidences of malaria are pretty slim. So that's not really a battle that Swedish government or health authorities have to fight. So a lot of these indicators are selected with a particular perspective, with a particular gaze in mind. I would like to highlight research that's been going on in Vanuatu here in Oceania, where people have set up their own indicators for well-being on Vanuatu. And one of the most interesting ones for me there was the number of people that pass through your homestead every week that are not family members. And the more people pass through your yard, the higher your social capital, your social connectedness. So if you look at the survey that's done in Vanuatu, the cutoff point is 20. So you are your high levels of well-being if there's more than 20 people passing through your yard every week that are not family members. Now that is a meaningful indicator in Vanuatu. More than 20 people passing through, saying hello, passing their respect, chatting. However, for me, as a Pākehā, as a white settler in New Zealand, it would not increase my well-being if there were 20 people, that is, let's say 3 a day, passing through my house just to say hello. I would experience that as a sort of an invasion of my privacy, and it would definitely unsettle me. So these indicators are meaningful in a particular location. And the problem with the SDGs is that the indicators were set as a result of a sort of a global negotiation process, whereby some voices counted more than others. And we end up measuring malaria, and we do not end up measuring the number of people that pass through your homestead. So there's a lot of issues going around with these comparative researches that I think we need to be aware of. And I think our team, credit to I think the way we operate. On the one hand, we carry out this comparative research. On the other hand, we're trying to be aware of the implications of what we're doing. And I think that sort of, trying to be upfront and honest is an important aspect here. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Gerard. Does anybody else have anything to add, thinking about SDGs?
Maybe I can just quickly comment, since I think I took up the SDGs as maybe a research interest since its inception. And I think I would agree with Gerard. I think one of the important things is to really contextualize the SDGs within the cultural context. If we look, or the societal context, if we look at the reports that Gerard is actually alluding to, islands lack data. So they don't really appear as part of the reports. And that's a reality in, I think, majority of islands. The quantity of data and the quality of data that's required is difficult to achieve. So I think the important thing, as we're doing in Grenada and as many other economies I think are doing, they're developing local sustainable development plans and trying to contextualize the SDGs within those local plans using local objectives, local goals, an attempt to align them with the SDGs. The other thing is, what I've realized is from a number of researches is that it's important to ensure that we integrate and look for synergies. One thing that we tend to do, we tend to tick box and say, okay, we have achieved SDG target 1, SDG target 2, we have not done SDG 3. But in looking at it, if we are achieving SDG target 1, whatever that is, we may be negating SDG target 13, 13.1 or 13.3. For looking at the SDG 14 and the whole concept of the idea of the blue economy, when we look at some of the focuses of the blue economy, if we create or try to create as many protected areas on our shores, we put people out of livelihoods. Some of the best fishing grounds may be, or the spawning grounds, or the fishing grounds may be located in those particular areas. If the fishermen cannot access the fishing grounds, then we put them out of livelihood. So I think the whole approach is to contextualize and to look at how we can integrate these SDGs into local planning going forward. That's my thought.
Can I chip into that, Laurie, or? I think John is making a great suggestion when it comes to trying to localize the SDGs. And I think the UN guidelines on the SDGs create space for that. So that has two sides, I think. On the one hand, the goals in themselves are just lofty statements. Eliminate poverty for everyone, etc. That's great. The point, however, is how do you measure that? What are the indicators that you choose to make that visible? To measure, to give it shape, to actually define what is sustainable consumption, what is healthy underwater life. And I think that is where islands, or every political community, if you want, has the space to say, okay, we have this goal of sustainable X, Y, or Z. But what does that mean? How do we measure that in our local environment? What is meaningful for us? And then, and I saw this as well as a comment in the chat by Jules. That brings us to another problem, which is data collection capacity. Islands, all small polities, struggle with statistical departments being overwhelmed with requests for data. There's a limited, as John also indicated, there's a limited amount of data available. And this is, I think, where civil society organizations, NGOs, academics can contribute to provide the data that statistical officers cannot collect. Even if it's patchy, if it's half done, it's better than nothing. And again, I think our research could potentially contribute to the need for data and information in each of the 12 territories that we work. Thanks.
If I could just, I know there may be other questions there, but just a comment. One of the things that we should be aware of, there's a whole literature out there on the education for sustainable development. And I think we've I've tapped into that a little bit. And I think that's something that we have to bring to bear in this project as well, because people learn about what sustainable development means in different ways, as several people have alluded to already. And so we have to look at all of the research that has taken place and the application of that research in terms of the educational process, both formal and informal mechanisms for understanding what sustainable development means within those contexts, right through youth and adulthood.
Thank you, Jim. Changing the subject now turning away from SDGs to talking about sustainable tourism, because that is a big part of what we're doing here. This is a question from Emma Lewis in Jamaica. She says, what do people understand by, quote, sustainable tourism? Is it a concept that is broadly spread across SDGs? I'm based in Jamaica, and sustainable tourism is a burning issue across the region. Our islands are so dependent on tourism, but I think there is an unclear perception of what sustainable tourism tourism is. Is it more of a catchphrase like blue economy, and seems incompatible with several developments on the island of Grenada, where foreign-owned tourism developments are threatening fragile ecosystems and endangered species? What is sustainable tourism for island dwellers, or perspectives from the sea and from the beach? A lot of stuff in there. Would anybody like to take that one on? Preeya or John? No.
I was hoping that Preeya was going to take the lead on that one. I was just trying to get my voice back after speaking so much on the SDGs. But yeah, but sustainable tourism, as the participant indicated, I can't remember her name, sorry, and thanks for the question from Jamaica, and mentioned the examples of Grenada, which are real life situations that's happening here now with two resorts, mega resorts, one 500-room and another, I think, 100-room, carded to be constructed close to very fragile ecosystems. And I think balancing the economic requirements or outputs from tourism and the environment, which tourism depends upon, is always a tricky, maybe political approach that our politicians in islands and other stakeholders have to look at very, very carefully. So sustainable tourism to maybe a politician may mean financial sustainability and growth. I don't know. He may be looking to bring in jobs, see it as a sustainable economic development, sustained from the perspective of being able to bring in monies, because with every discussion that we hear from the leadership side, the policy making side, is once we speak to, well, we will protect the environment, but we need to bring jobs. It would bring 500 jobs during construction, another 1,000 jobs during the operational phase. But as we see tourism in that way, when it is that large, the impact as seen from COVID-19 and as we have seen from hurricanes and the likes, is also very much harder and very much more difficult to recover from. So it is a very difficult balancing act between the economy and environmental protection and conservation. And I think we have this project that Preeya and I are looking at, and looking at the perceptions that we've gotten from people, we may be able to dig a little bit deeper into understanding the perceptions and the perspectives, and maybe offer some more insight into this whole idea of sustainable tourism for islands.
Thanks, John, for going first. So yeah, our island pair would specifically look at sustainable tourism. One of the good things about this project is that we have the opportunity to speak to islanders as to what sustainable tourism means to them. So I would have presented the questionnaire results asking about the different components of sustainable tourism, including climate change, culture and heritage, social impact, economic impact, environmental impact. And in the questionnaire, it's quite easy for the respondents to strongly agree that they see climate change as important for sustainable tourism. They see environmental preservation as important for sustainable tourism, etc. Now, where the study really adds, I believe, is where we actually conducted the focus groups. And this is where we sort of pulled out some details from the respondents. So respondents were asked about their perception of sustainable tourism, and that relates to everything I just said about strongly agreeing that everything that is good relates to sustainable tourism. What we found interesting from the focus groups, we actually found that persons were able to identify sustainable tourism practices in their own everyday lives. So the average Tobagonian spoke about using green electricity green cards, for instance, also in their own definition of sustainable tourism, they brought up the issue of reliable transport links. In the everyday definition of sustainable tourism, this issue is not raised, except where you specifically look at the issues of small islands. So reliable transport links and destination marketing for small islands, these were raised as important issues in Tobago as to sustainable tourism practices. Another important issue raised concerning sustainable tourism practices out of the focus groups, again, not the questionnaire, would have been the whole concept of community tourism and the model of community tourism, which has been very successful in some parts of Tobago, and other areas are now trying to replicate that model. And lastly, I'll close with just one other practice that the respondents brought out as important, which we didn't actually have in the questionnaire, but the issue raised would have been ecological research, management, protection, and conservation. Across in Tobago, we had a lot of NGOs who participated in the focus groups, and they are actually involved in this type of ecological research, not just research, but management and conservation. And all these issues were identified as important for sustainable tourism in small islands.
Thank you, Preeya. We have time for just one more quick question, and this is an overarching question from Jules Eve and Alexandra Regi. They're two of the, or maybe that's one person, one of the Virtual Island Summit ambassadors from Haiti, and he asks, this is an open question, should we still keep the label SIDS and CIS, small island states, or should we run with the large ocean states label? What would be the consequence on how we look at small island states and subnational island jurisdictions? So if we, instead of the SID-CIS category, large ocean states, what does anybody have to add? Jim, would you like to quickly?
I'll start, but given that the large ocean states moniker is probably more popular, becoming more popular in Oceania than elsewhere, maybe Gerard might have a comment on that as well. I think there's almost an institutional foundation to the concept of SIDS, because it's embedded within our international structures. When we think of the Alliance of Small Island States, for example, and the role that they've played at an international level in shifting the attitudes of the world bodies to climate change and sustainable development, it's going to be very difficult to actually move away from those acronyms, because they have value attached to the acronym itself. But when you look at the individual island, and maybe this is where I'm going to ask Gerard to make a comment on it, it's meaningless to the individual island. And my understanding, my limited understanding, is it really is a colonial kind of vestige, where you're thinking of these small specks of land within a vast ocean, when an islander, historically, culturally, and politically and economically, there's often this seamless boundary between the ocean and the land, and their livelihood, their relationships with other peoples has never really been separated by sort of an ocean. So I understand why the large ocean states, especially given the Convention on the Law on the Sea, and what that did is a really more appropriate label to allow people to use if they wish to use that. And I'll stop there before I get myself into trouble.
I don't see any need to get into trouble, Jim. I think you just captured it as I would have from let's say, an Oceania perspective from where I'm sitting. So not much to add, except when I came to New Zealand, I came with this sort of colonial, if you want, Western idea of islands being small places in a huge ocean. And then looking at the map of the Pacific, it's like, it's frightening. It's like there's specks, and specks is already exaggerating it. And when you start reading, and things shift your mind. And one piece that really kind of made me change my perspective was the work from A.P. Haulofa, who said these are not islands in a large sea. this is a sea of islands. And if you start to think about that, and the perception, as you rightly point out, Jim, is like people are connected. The boundaries between land and water are not as clear as for many islanders as they were for Europeans. So yes, it has a meaning, large ocean states in the Pacific, in geopolitical terms, access to the resources. But it has always been like that, I think, in the mind of many people in the Pacific. So not much to add. There's a sort of consensus building, I think. That's cool to see. Thank you.
Wonderful, Gerard. What a lovely image to leave it on then. Yes, a sea of islands. So at this point, we've reached the end of our time. There are a number of questions that didn't get answered, but we do have them in a spreadsheet, and I will forward them to all of our speakers. And if anybody wants to take any of them on and contact the askers, the questioners through email, they can we can help facilitate that. I know that a few people in the chat were asking about presentations, and we will be uploading our presentations onto the platform so that you'll be able to see them. I know that this is being recorded as well. So hopefully if you want to spread the word that here's a great conversation about this topic, please let people know where the recording is. If you would like to follow up with any of us on this, we're quite open to that. You can reach us through islandstudies.com. We have that website for our Island Studies work, as well as IIS, or Institute of Island Studies, at upei.ca. You're quite welcome to send questions through there, and I'll direct them on. As you heard, we're only halfway through the project, so I suspect there will be, in another year or so, there will be more to report, and looking forward to that very much. And I know that some people were saying, gee, I wish we'd included, like Puerto Rico or Saint Pierre and Miquelon or Jamaica. So, there's a lot of islands out there that could benefit from this same kind of a gaze, right? And looking at this topic through that those islands through this lens. So again, thank you to our panelists today, Mark and Jim, Preeya, Gerard, and John. I really have loved hearing what you have to say, and you've been all so articulate and eloquent, bringing forth the work that we've done so far, and I appreciate your generosity in giving us the benefit of your wisdom here today. Thanks, Maggie, for being behind the scenes, fielding the questions, and thanks, James, for organizing, and your whole Island Innovation team. It's been absolutely terrific to see and to be part of this, virtual Island Summit. Finally, thank you to the audience. Your questions just from the chat that I could see, I kind of got lost there for a minute, and I couldn't find it again, but very engaged audience, and really, really appreciate you taking the interest and the time to listen into this presentation. So I know there's more to come over the next week, and I'm sure that, I don't know, James, if you wanted to say anything, but really, really happy to be part of this today. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Laurie.
Thank you, Laurie.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye now. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Talk soon.
Bye.